A lot of speculation recently, and I factor in my own observations into this, has rested on the idea that Nintendo's pressure has led to Game Freak taking a longer time on the Gen 10 Pokemon games than was previously the case. But I wonder though, to what degree this is actually true. In fact, the more I look at it, the more I suspect that there's a longer range plan in place going back potentially a decade, but certainly that has accelerated over recent years. Let's take a look. Firstly, we should recall that while Nintendo has a large degree of control over Pokemon, its official ownership stake is 32%, and so in concert with Game Freak and Creatures, the Pokemon brand is managed and controlled by the independent operation of the Pokémon Company, which is a corporation made up from the three founding corporations. Also, Game Freak are responsible for the games, and Creatures are involved in much other content, such as 3D models, the card game, and more, so the idea of Nintendo laying down the law without let or hindrance doesn't necessarily fly, even if in theory they could force their will to do so. All that said, it's certainly true that a 3-year schedule has become the default for Pokemon for a very long time. Gold and Silver followed 3 years and 9 months after the original titles, Ruby and Sapphire about 3 years on, and since then only the 4th generation's Diamond and Pearl stands out, with a few weeks shy of a 4-year gap since the prior title. Since then, though, Generations 5 in 2010 through to Generation 9 in 2022 have had a very rigid 3-year structure. 5 consecutive generations is a serious pattern, and we can also identify pretty well what underpinned it. Unlike anything else in the Nintendo slate, Pokemon is interconnected with a vast enterprise that is driven by the games, movies, TV series, the card game, apps, and merchandise. To a large degree, the engine of that whole enterprise is the core game series, and so they need to have a regular slate of new titles. However, in recent years, we have seen a decoupling of the Pokémon Company from their historic strategies in almost all of these regards. In 2020, COVID delayed the Pokémon film Secrets of the Jungle from the July window that had been a Pokémon staple for the prior 22 years. The film eventually released on Christmas Day, but no further films have been released since. On the other hand, their first live-action dalliance, Detective Pikachu, did do surprisingly well in 2019, even though the sequel seems to have entered development hell. With film box offices declining even pre-pandemic, with the advent of streaming, a process only sped up by concern about a global pathogen this decade, it's not a surprise that the Pokémon Company have decided, it seems, to pivot away from films for the time being. As for TV series, with Ash Ketchum facing his final battle in spring 2023, it would have been perilously difficult to even countenance a change in the schedule to Scarlet and Violet. And so you can imagine Nintendo and the Pokémon Company seeing the impending November release date coming, seeing the game in the state that was not close to being ready, and regarding it as a kind of slow-motion train wreck, something that they could not really avoid, but something that must never happen again. I rather suspect that there was indeed a plot prior to 2020 of having a mid-gen power boost version of the Switch of some description, so at least a 2022 release as originally intended might have had the safety net that at least with the top Switch hardware it would deliver decent enough performance to avoid too much criticism, but without that buffer, and with COVID having wreaked all sorts of havoc on the Nintendo development pipeline, I imagine a 2022 would have been a very stressful period for Nintendo and the Pokémon Company indeed. However, you can't just step away from a major cash cow like the films and television series without a backup plan, even if audiences were contracting in these fields. And the Pokémon Company, as it turns out, did have a backup plan in place: Pokémon Go. Unlike Nintendo, who, with the exception of the Japan-centric Fire Emblem Heroes, hasn't really sustained a global smartphone mega-hit, the Pokémon Company instantly became absolutely massive in 2016 with Pokémon Go, and this surge of income and attention surely decoupled the series massively from its need to rely on the same kind of business model they had sustained up until this point. Now, by the time it was clear that Go was the kind of big hit it was, they evidently had certain things already lined up. Gen 7 would be locked into 2019 as per their regular cycle, and Let's Go, tying into the branding and Gen 1 focus of Pokémon Go, was there to capitalize on the success of the mobile title. But it's what the Pokémon Company did next that is particularly interesting. Their secondary development team went on not to Let's Go 2 or even a different remake, but rather to Legends Arceus. Now, it's not quite as clear-cut as this. In fact, many of the senior teams credited people from Let's Go are quite scattered, with some, such as Masuda, moving to a more hands-off senior role, others like field programming director Ikeuchi seeming to leave the Pokémon Company entirely, and others like system programmer Onoe ending up on Arceus as his lone way station before focusing on the Game Freak original project, Beasts of Reincarnation. However, from a budgeting perspective, it seems inarguable that both Brilliant Diamond and Shining Pearl and Pokémon Legends ZA were the fruits of the successful period from 2016 to 2019, with the success first of Pokémon Go and then of the Switch Pokémon entries. They simply wouldn't have had the budget to mount both of these projects without that prior success. Now, I can imagine that when Scarlet and Violet was commissioned, the Pokémon Company probably would have set 2022 in stone, because at that point, 2019-ish in all likelihood, the continued success was uncertain. The Switch in 2019 was a successful system, but not yet the all-time record setter that it became in 2020. I can see a cautious Nintendo from the vantage point of 2019 being quite comfortable with the Pokémon Company sticking to the 3-year Pokémon cycle. However, a lot had changed by 2022. Arceus had proven a strong success, indicating that a different and parallel style of Pokémon experience could thrive independent of the generational titles. Both Nintendo and the Pokémon Company had enjoyed 3 years of all-time high sales, meaning that the high-wire act of the tight time schedule was no longer strictly necessary. Shuntaro Furukawa was now established as the Nintendo president and was able to start evolving his plans, even though he was involved in long-term planning even before he succeeded the presidency in 2018. Hardware power was meaning that development times were escalating across the board, including for the Pokémon Company, and long-term market changes were making things like the anime less of a vital foothold for the series than it once was. My point is that I don't think the decision to delay Winds and Waves out of 2025 was made in response to Scarlet and Violet. I think it was probably on the cards since at least the start of 2022, and probably for some years prior. Now, we know from leaks the 2026 release date was originally planned for Winds and Waves, and the Pokémon Company obviously had to have made some kind of course correction during this point. If Winter 2024 was once the release date planned for Switch 2, though, Winter 2026 might well have been the release date planned for the Switch 2 Lite. Now, I do think that the presence of an accessible handheld system will be extremely significant for the success of the next Pokémon. That doesn't necessarily mean that the Switch 2 Lite needs to release first. Perhaps having a massive sales period on Switch 2 and then getting a second wind and second wave from partnering with the Switch Lite a few months later would be a financially prudent approach to selling the game and the machine. But either way, it must be a factor in their consideration of where to position Pokémon. Even if it weren't, though, the Pokémon Company simply isn't tied to the treadmill it once was. Their animated series are diverse, Go remains a consistent through line, and they have the Legends games to add content and interest between mainline releases. That's not to say that they want these games to take too long. They're still major money-making opportunities, but with Legends mainline games and the likelihood of Gen 5 remakes, which of course includes direct sequel Black 2 and White 2, so they could potentially get 2 games this generation out of the Gen 5 remakes, well, they can still potentially fill the generation with major titles, even at a slower cadence, and still have time for more experimental activities, such as an AR-focused console title or a Pokémon MMO. Of course, this is against a lot of the assumptions we've made, but I think it makes sense that Scarlet and Violet was not necessarily the trigger for their recent changes, but simply the unavoidable last title of a plan that by that point was already changing, but for which there was very little they could do apart from stick to plan A and release it even despite the flaws that the game evidently had at launch. For more, as ever, please check out the Patreon, and if you want to hype, like, comment and subscribe, it would be appreciated. But if not, I'm still so grateful you are here, and I will see you next time for another Nintendo Forecast.